Why it had to be him, of all captains, who were exploring the most likely uninhabited major galactic arm, to come across this unknown ship where nothing but an empty void was expected. Captain, I'm confident we have a good firing solution to partially destroy the unknown ship and leave at least a few survivors. The more Captain Emoit listened to the advice of his weapons officer, the more he felt the urge to attack it. Despite being aware that the vessel had done nothing to deserve such an aggressive response, he found it increasingly difficult to suppress the fidgeting of his four fingers, which seemed to be itching for a fight. What kind of strike are we talking about here? Captain Elmoit asked this, intending to disguise the fact that he needed more time to consider the political implications of deliberately souring the relationship with an unknown primitive alien species. He needed to weigh the pros and cons of allowing a new and potentially useless race to join the Galactic Council, which his species had founded and where they still held significant voting rights. CSX closed two of his 6 eyes as he formulated a detailed reply. We can't use the lasers or swarm them with kinetics. Their warp core seems dangerously unstable, and we could blow it up accidentally if we damage some important structure. Our best alternative would be a blank missile aimed at their sublight propulsion, Captain. A blank? The third and last crew member on the bridge interjected. Even the most basic shield would stop that. For the Great One's sake, Velul, you don't need to make it even more clear than it already is that you are only here because of the influence of your clan. CSS couldn't understand why the captain had asked everyone except himself, and the useless spore brat before him, to stay on the bridge. The blinking text on the tap map says that the object in question is only classified as P3 on the technology scale, which means no shield, no stealth, no phase drive, nor anything that uses exotic energy. How else do you think our sensors can probe it so deeply to the point where we know the exact location of its warp core? Exasperation took hold of Velul, but since the captain had all his 6 eyes locked on him at the moment, he tried to downplay his lack of knowledge, instead of cursing Velul's ancestors and descendants, as he would have done otherwise. I'm a diplomat, not a handy labourer. I'm under no obligation of knowing such details. Enough of this! Captain Emoit took a break from his fidgeting to ask Velul a question, in the only field the first-class moron was slightly useful to diffuse the tension. Velul, what would be the outcome if we choose not to take any action against the unknown vessel, and instead return to charted territory? Nothing good, Captain. Even if no one from the crew speaks, it would just be a matter of time until someone else finds the species again, and the lower races would be more than delighted to include them in the council, to erode even more of our influence, Velul explained. That settles it then. It didn't feel right to attack a defenseless species that must be crawling straight out of their cradle to the galactic stage. But Emoit was far from being an idealist that was ready to do what must be done. Summon the crew back to their stations and ready the missile. Don't forget to inform them that we will not be using any payload today. Emoit spaced out after giving the order. Only a few of them would die. It's probably better for them to be afraid of us anyway. Maybe they are very resistant and only their ship will be damaged. Such were the excuses Emoit was telling himself, as he watched his crew do all the preparations required to engage in combat. For a while he got lost in his thoughts, with the voices of his subordinates in the background. But when silence ensued, and he noticed Sirex's meaningful gaze waiting for the order, Emoit was resolute. Fire! After the crew received his order, several actions occurred almost simultaneously. First, the ship's shields had their cell parameters changed, diverting all previously used power to active defense. Next, a single missile was ejected from its housing and immediately activated its propulsion system. Finally, the computers calculated an exit point in the shields, and performed the complex calculations necessary to create a momentary opening for the missile to pass through. Emoit's 6 eyes reached locked into a different place of the TAC map. He wouldn't even blink as each breath he took showed the missile getting closer and closer to reaching the target. Now it was just a matter of waiting to see if the unknown ship would try to steer away, or launch their subpar interceptors if they had any. Or so he thought, as the ludicrously long alien spaceship tilted itself in the y-axis, in a movement that looked so wrong to the eye that it seemed to violate some fundamental law of physics, only for it to face the incoming missile that inexplicably blew up before hitting the target. Captain Emoit blinked his 6 eyes frantically to try and fix his sight. It was as if he considered the chance of them failing him as being far greater than that of a primitive species having an unknown method of destroying that missile, without the hundreds of activated sensors of his ship capturing it. Yet he soon realized he was not the only one seeing this reality, as many inquiring eyes fell upon him. CSX, what are the odds of spontaneous failure of our missile? That is... 6X shallowed heavily. Inconclusive, sir. Elaborate. Captain Airmite was not usually terse in his orders, and that alone was enough to increase Sir Six's anxiety. I mean, even in the war against the Lulul Empire, where millions of them were fired, we haven't registered a single failure, so it's not possible to calculate the odds. Prepare an Before Captain Airmite could order another strike and navigate a shadow from his station, she was at 99%. Now that was concerning, because 4 of Airmite's eyes had never left the tap map in anticipation of a retaliation attack from the unknown vessel. And yet, even now, it was showing nothing but empty space between the two ships and the 3D projection. Change the source of input of the tab map to the backup sensors. It was easier for Captain Airmite to believe that there was a problem in the sensors than to consider the possibility of a species on the P3 scale being able to attack his ship stealthily. But the statuses of the sensor are reporting that everything is normal. Just do it! Captain Airmite shouted in fury, as an engineer tried to dissuade him from doing something stupid. An awkward silence propagated on the bridge as the tap map went dark and returned to the same state it was before the change a couple of breaths later. Their big ship on one side of the battlefield, and a small but ludicrously long unknown vessel on the other side. No projectile or laser visible anywhere. The awkward silence endured a while, but ultimately was broken by the same navigator as before. Shields at 95%. It hurt his ego to consider that his state-of-the-art tac map was not telling him the whole picture of what was going on with the shields, but there was just so much further one could go when denying reality. Put the optical sensors on the screen. It seems we are doing it the old-fashioned way today. The fact that they were hearing a sensible order put some relief in the hearts of the crew, but it was short-lived and only lasted until the images of the outside were displayed on the screen. Hundreds, no. Thousands of micro-explosions were happening on the shields in every frame the sensor was capturing, and even worse, the area of impact was not limited to a single point. This can't be. 6S couldn't find words to describe what his 6 eyes were seeing. Whispers were heard everywhere, until it escalated to loud chat. Then panic. Keep it together, Captain Airmite addressed the growing distress of his crew, by using some basic logic. It looks scary in the video, but at this rate the shields will hold for a long time, so we just need to figure out how their weapon works and devise a counter-strategy. If worse comes to worse, we just use the lasers and blow up their warp core. His resurging words quelled the fear of the crew successfully, but the words of the navigator that followed reminded them that they were still running against the clock. Shields at 90%. The electromagnetic field. Now that the current reality has sunk in, CSX managed to offer a piece of useful advice. We should filter out anything but the electromagnetic field from the TAC map. CSX's comment was met with a barrage of skeptical gazes from the engineering officers, who still remembered well the fiasco of Captain Airmite's last order, of changing the operational parameters of the TAC map. Valor also added a smug gaze, which immediately made the weapon officer doubt his own idea, and think of it as stupid. Captain Airmite, however, trusted him, and was not afraid of doubling down. Do as he said. The engineering officers exchanged looks of doubt, but there was nothing they could do but obey their captain, despite any of their own opinions on the matter. Once they typed in the command to discard any input, except those coming from the electromagnetic sensors, the tap map went dark again as they waited in anticipation for the system to reboot itself. Unlike the previous instance, however, when the projection returned it showed not the same stagnant and boring battlefield, but one where the small unknown vessel had been replaced by a behemoth of a magnetic field. And that was not all. The empty space that was previously devoid of action was now filled with so many tiny dots, travelling at near relativistic speeds, that it was impossible to discern any individual projectile, only groups of them. They are attacking us with... What was happening was so ridiculous that CSX had trouble saying the words, with a beam of electrically charged dust. Astonishment spread like a contagious disease on the bridge, and left stunned even the more stoic among them. The engineering officers were the ones hit the hardest, and immediately proceeded to go through the raw data to try and validate their denial. Valor was not affected so much because he was having trouble understanding what was going on. What you were waiting for? Activate the thrusters already! Captain Airmite was as much surprised as everyone else, but different from them, he had reined his emotions in so well that his decision-making skills were not impaired by them. Also, shoot them with the railguns. I have a hunch they won't be able to keep this beam locked into us if they are too busy dodging. His resolute voice put the team on the same page, and helped them recover enough of their confidence to perform their duty. So what if a primitive species had managed to catch them by surprise with some crazy weapon? Now that they knew what they were dealing with, there was nothing to be scared of. Even the engineering officers, who were not fully convinced of the accuracy of the data, had to agree that moving away and shooting back was not a bad idea. With renewed energy, and a clear task to perform, now it was just a matter of following established procedures, just like they had done so many times in training. CSX took the lead in commanding the weapons staff, while each staff officer did the same for their respective functions. Captain Airmwhite could see the relief in the eyes of his team when the micro-explosions immediately stopped on the screen when the thrusters activated. The navigator this time remained silent about the shields, while 16 heavy projectiles made of a strong alloy were fired at 1/4 of the speed of light towards the target. Their extrapolated trajectories, one of the shots aimed at the current position of the alien ship, and the others aimed at where it might flee to, appeared in the tap map at once. "It's over now. Such a pity there won't be any survivors." Valou wouldn't miss the opportunity to look smart and hopefully gain some respect for pretending to keep a sober head while everyone was acting so seriously. I guess we can't expect too much from a species in the P3 scale after all. "Shut up, Valou, don't jinx it." CSX wouldn't allow someone who had just learned what a P3 scale species was to gain the spotlight by making obvious observations. Captain Airmwhite ignored the noise as he thought about how the imprecision of his previous order accumulated in his staff firing enough kinetic projectiles to leave the target without a path of retreat. He could only blame himself for underestimating the mental stress of his subordinates and giving a vague order under such conditions. What's done is done, and later he would have to deal with the consequences. So he forced himself to watch the demise of his enemy through the projection. Once the projectiles crossed a certain threshold, without the unknown vessel activating their thrusters, Airmwhite was certain that whatever species inhabited it had already accepted its fate and was preparing to die. The thing about kinetic projectiles was that their maneuverability was limited, and they took some time to reach their target. This meant that after getting close enough, they couldn't be dodged anymore. Suddenly, however, the tap map showed that they had aimed the beam of charged dust at the single piece of metal that would hit them if they remained in their current position. "That's useless," CSS commented. "Their small explosions will at most heat the metal. Even if they manage to melt it, the kinetic energy won't go anywhere." Captain Airmwhite knew that even an interceptor missile would have a hard time stopping a target of that size at such speed, so he certainly agreed with the comment of his weapons officer, as he waited for the moment of impact. One more breath was all it would take. One breath might seem like too little time, but when talking about things crashing against each other at a significant fraction of the speed of light, that's a different story. Upon hitting the first 10 million charged particles, the metal projectile began to glow red. When the number of collisions approached the first billion, all there was left of the pointy projectile was a stream of liquid metal. Captain Airmwhite barely saw what happened after. The optics sensors had captured everything, but his perception was not able to keep up with the images. Not that this was the first thing that came to his mind at that moment, because the unknown vessel was still there in a single piece. "Was that supposed to happen?" asked Velul. Captain Airmwhite ignored the question and relayed the moment of impact in slow motion, without addressing the looks of distress he was getting from the crew. What he saw was a trail of molten metal, maybe even plasma, almost hitting the primitive ship, but ultimately being diverted, while transferring only a small fraction of its momentum to the frame of the ship. It only took him a single glance at the data of the tap map to understand what had happened. The magnetic field of the primitive ship had acted as a shield, and had saved it from destruction. With 4 of his eyes locked into the tap map, Airmwhite was considering the next course of action and preparing to check on the crew, when he heard a voice that was growing increasingly annoyed to his ears the more he heard it. "Shields at 60%. High levels of radiation detected." Captain Airmwhite saw many explosions in the shields, but this time there was so much light being emitted that it was impossible to see it clearly. He didn't know how it had happened, but somehow his ship was being attacked by invisible dust yet again. The only difference was that this time the explosions were looking much more powerful than before. "They have neutralized the charge of the dust before firing it at us. That's why we aren't seeing anything in the electromagnet field." Having his life on the line was a great incentive for CSX to push his deductive reasoning abilities beyond his normal limits. "Also, the dust particles are radioactive this time." No gazes of doubt or overreactions were fired at CSX. Only silence and unenthusiastic acceptance. What kind of degenerate species would weaponize dust in such a way that a P3 vessel would wreak havoc on a technologically superior enemy? At this point, they only wished to survive long enough to find out. The first attack was just a distraction to make us complacent. They got us good. Not even in his most pessimistic assumptions, Captain Ehmwait had assumed this fight would turn into a life-and-death battle. Now he had no choice but to walk even further in the path he had chosen. Set the lasers to maximum power and fire at will. Aim it at their warp core. There was no more room for underestimating his foe. No more room for pity or indecisiveness. The species that had designed this weird ship deserved to be treated as a worthy foe. His crew and species were depending on him to report back to his superiors, to ensure the scientists would prepare countermeasures for this unusual technology. It was clear the need to prepare against possible retaliation, thanks to his own unforgivable mistake of attacking a species that was minding its own business. His order reverberated with such urgency that no thought process was needed by the crew to perform the aiming procedures. Survival instinct was a powerful weapon when preceded by intensive training, so no mistake was made and only a brief pause was needed for the computer to take care of every complex step that involved creating a powerful beam of light with all available energy. Shut up, not now! Unlike the slow kinetic projectiles, there was only enough time for the navigator and the captain to exchange a few words before receiving confirmation that the lasers had hit the target. The optic sensors were momentarily rendered useless by the bright light emitted when the deadly touch of the powerful beam met the target. What Captain Ehmwait expected to see next was the whole screen going blank, with the explosion of a warp core outshining any leaking light from the point of impact of the laser, but instead what he saw was the optic sensors slowly adapting to high levels of brightness as he painfully waited for the aftermath to unfold to his 6 eyes. When the great revelation finally occurred, he wasn't even surprised, just regretful. Regretful that the last thing he would see would be a technologically inferior species sending their sorry asses to oblivion after winning a fight that had every single odd against them. They are using magnet dust as a shield against the lasers. The particles must be so lightweight that they can move nearly as fast as a magnet field. By concentrating them into a single point, the lasers melt them and create a bubble of glowing metal that converts light into heat and radiates it away in many spectra of... Captain Ehmwait felt a certain kind of sadness, realizing that CSX was so focused on his deductions that he was blind to the whole picture. It was all over. Shields down. The hull has been breached. Sublight engines were compromised. Warp core emergency shutdown initiated. Radiation level is critical. It was utterly disconcerting watching his crew holding on to their stations and performing their duties even when all further actions would be in vain. Ehmwait couldn't believe that none of them were able to tell that there was no need to fight anymore. Or maybe they could, and it was just easy to pretend they didn't. It was hard to understand how others might react to the cruel reality, after all. He, for once, found some solace in paying for his mistakes by returning to the void, so he closed his eyes and kept his composure as he waited for the end. The chaotic sympathy of the voices of his staff in the background was supposed to be the last thing he heard, but after a while, silence reminded him that he was not dead yet. Upon opening his 6 eyes at once, he found his whole crew, except Velu, who had passed out at some point, staring at him awkwardly. "We're alive, Maybe they've run out of dust." Seeing that the captain's words did nothing to diffuse the awkwardness, CSX came to his rescue. "They've been hailing us for some time, sir." The ramifications of this unknown ship, knowing their communication protocols were endless, but Captain Ehmwait was way beyond the point of stressing himself over such details. Put them through. The crew exchanged looks of concern at the thought of letting the captain handle the following conversation in his current state, but ultimately someone opened the channel before any of them could object to the order. A strange beam with 4 too few eyes and a protruding structure in the middle of its pale face popped up on the screen. "I would normally start this conversation by introducing myself, saying the name of this vessel, but even that seems too much courtesy for someone who attacks an unknown ship as a form of greeting. I'm... Before Captain Ehmwait could attempt a one-sided introduction, or some sentence recognizing them as worthy foes for turning the tables against him, the being cut him off. "It doesn't matter who you are, but there are a few things you should know to avoid unnecessary loss of sapient life. This is not the first, but the third encounter of our species in the sidereal void, and as you might be able to guess, the first 2 encounters ended up almost like this one." Ehmwait's eyes widened at the revelation. His previous assessment of what rock bottom meant had to be instantly redefined in his imagination. "So far, we managed to capture a semi-intact ship from your species, and we are keeping the survivors safe in the prison we built especially for them on our moon, since they can't handle the gravity of our planet, nor would they be safe on the surface for other reasons. Emate already could tell how this conversation was going to end. If what they said was to be believed, even blowing up the ship to avoid it being captured was useless now. And given that they already possessed some software for doing real-time translations, he had little reason to doubt their claims. After some time studying your species, we've learned about your language, your culture, and your motivations for attacking us. And since no one has lost their lives on our side so far, we've offered a deal to the captives that I will now extend to all of you. As long as you surrender your ship and behave, we are going to return you to your homeworld with a formal letter of refusal to join your Galactic Council. That will be done as soon as our scientists manage to replicate all of your technology. Our current estimates suggest it won't take more than 2 years, and with another one of your ships for them to play with, I can say with certainty it won't take that long. So what do you say? Captain Airmite was speechless. From the very beginning, there had been no tables to be turned, only prey foolishly gifting itself to the predators and the silver plate. The not-so-distant memories of the time before he had made up his mind on attacking the unknown ship flooded his core, as a deep feeling of outrage emerged. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring against him, was led him to briefly consider blowing up the ship out of spite. Something he would undoubtedly have done if not for the impact of the distressful looks he received from his subordinates, as they anxiously expected his next order. "We surrender." Those 2 words were all Captain Airmite's pride allowed him to say, before handing over the negotiations to Circex and becoming a spectator in the background in solitude. Strangely, no fear or apprehension haunted his mind at the thought of becoming a prisoner in an alien world outside of the charted territory. Airmite had no family nor close friends, so without his pride as a captain, not much desire to live was left in him. The only thing he looked forward to was seeing the waves of terror in his superior's eyes when a group of missing staff would be brought back home in the future. That is, if the beings on the other side of the screen kept their word, and allowed them to live that long.